Greetings all, Ferrariman601 here. The next team to unveil their 2017 Formula One car, Force India, and today, for the first time in public, we see, with the covers off, the VJM10, the car with which Force India are officially targeting third place in the Constructors' Championship. That is a very lofty goal, admittedly, by Force India, considering that they have never fought so highly in the Constructors' Championship before, but evidently they are already very confident in the VJM10. Let's take a look and see whether or not that confidence is warranted. First off, we see this first shot of the car from a square-on front-end view. And the first thing that strikes us about it is the nose. Unlike Sauber and unlike Renault, Force India have gone for a slightly different nose solution. Sauber and Renault are using what I've been terming the thumbnail nose, which is a very slight protrusion of the very extreme end of the nose where it tapers to a point. Force India are using a nose configuration that has some similarities to Sauber and Renault, but also has some similarities to what we saw in 2014 with the finger noses. Some other body parts were compared to the shapes of those noses, but I'll call them the finger nose. That's what we are seeing here on the Force India. Similarly to Sauber and Renault, we see the front wing mounted on pylons on either side of that nose, but we do see a significantly longer protrusion of the very tip of the nose. As to why Force India have chosen to do this, well, perhaps there are a couple reasons. The first one that I'm thinking about, though, is it allows them to take the height of the overall nose section a little bit higher up, thus allowing more air to be funneled underneath the nose section and then to be channeled toward the T-tray, the radiators, and then ultimately to the floor and to the diffuser. So perhaps that is one reason. The other reason why potentially they have chosen to do something like this is maybe they had some issues getting the front end past the crash test and they needed just a little bit more resiliency up there, thus warranting the increased length of the deformable, crushable structure to absorb that impact energy. I don't know. I don't know if we'll ever find out for sure, but Force India clearly fielding a very different nose design than the rest of the field so far. Moving away from the nose now toward the front wing, another very complex and quite intricate front wing on a launch spec Formula One car. It's a little bit difficult to discern the very fine details on this simply because we have a black wing against a black background. However, we can definitely see that there are a number of flaps on the main plane as well as a number of cascade elements to the extreme edges of the main wing flaps, and I can count at least 4 layers to each. So at least 4 layers on the main plane and at least 4 distinct cascade elements to the extreme left and right sides of the wing. So again, another F1 team using a complicated, very well-developed wing in launch spec. I think we're going to be seeing a lot of competition, particularly in front-end aero, this year. Moving away from the nose cone proper, we can see the front suspension layout, another double wishbone pushrod configuration. Like I said, in the Renault review, it looks like that front suspension layout is going to be ubiquitous up and down the grid, and here we are on the Force India, now the third car that we've seen in the flesh using a double wishbone pushrod layout. On the chassis, where the suspension pickup points are, where you can see those push rods going into the top of the chassis, we see, and we're going to see this a little bit better on some subsequent shots, but we see a step in the chassis. Very similar to what we had in 2012 when the cars had that very ugly stepped section of the chassis leading down to the maximum height that was permitted for that year. Force India, rather than fitting a vanity panel or rather than just allowing the chassis gracefully to taper down to that maximum height at that point where the suspension centerline is, Force India have simply thrown in a step. Again, why would a team do this? Perhaps they couldn't get around the suspension geometries. They had to mount the dampers where they had to mount the dampers, and therefore they ran out of space to taper the chassis down to that maximum height, and they just had to throw a step in. The step was introduced for the same reasons why we later on had those finger noses in 2014, and basically for the same reason why Force India are now using this finger nose in 2017. It's to lower the front of the chassis so that there's less chance of getting penetration into the cockpit from a 90-degree perpendicular accident. So Force India using a step plane here, it's not very elegant, and personally I was thinking Formula One was beyond this, but here it is on a 2017 car courtesy of Force India. And on this next shot, we're still looking at the car squarely from the front, but we have moved upward a bit in terms of our camera position, and we're able to draw our eyes toward the midsection of the car. First, in the cockpit area, nothing too spectacular going on here. We have a very normal mirror placement. The mirror's mounted on these small curved stalks that are coming directly off of the sides of the cockpit surround, very typical nowadays. And we also see the cockpit surround basically homologated in the regulations for two reasons. Predominantly, it is for driver head protection. So first off, the drivers experience tremendous G-force, and although they train very hard to cope with those G-forces, the drivers do have a bit of bolstering to rest their heads on if they absolutely have to in the later stages of a race and they start to get tired. Secondly, and more importantly, that cockpit surround is to provide some cushion in the event of a side impact, a sideways impact into a barrier, so that the driver's head and helmet have something soft to run into, rather than, like they used to in the old days, have the driver's head physically smack against the side of the crash barrier that they had just run into. So good on Formula One for implementing those safety features. Moving up and slightly arrears of the cockpit, although it's not arrears in terms of our vantage point here, we see the airbox. And just like Renault have done, and just like Sauber have done, Force India have subdivided the plenum inside the air snorkel. They have not split it in terms of two channels that go into the car and using a blade style roll bar like Sauber had. However, they have subdivided that air snorkel into at least three distinct chambers that we can see here. We have that main one, which probably is to feed the engine, and then we have two smaller ancillary channels on either side of that. Who knows what they're feeding? One is probably for cooling, maybe for the turbo, maybe for the gearbox, maybe a combination of the two, and who knows, maybe that's the entire functionality of all of those chambers. One for gearbox cooling, one for turbo cooling. Who knows? We'll probably never know, but interesting to see the teams so far 100% subdividing that air snorkel. Very interesting development. Also, and the resolution of this shot is not the best, I do apologize, but we can also see the turning vanes on this car, and they are a completely different design to either the Sauber or the Renault, the two cars that we have seen in the flesh so far. Unlike Renault, who have had their turning vanes spaced out quite a bit from the sides of the side pods proper, Force India have integrated the turning vanes into a winglet that appears to run in front of the radiator inlets and slightly above them, and then the turning vanes proper connect at a 90-degree elbow joint to that little winglet, and then they go downward toward the floor. I can't see from this shot if they actually connect to the floor, but I can see a stay coming from just to the side and slightly behind the radiator inlets on each side pod, so certainly an interesting turning vane design going on here. We also get a slightly better angle on the front suspension. Again, nothing too spectacular happening there in terms of suspension geometry, just a double wishbone pushrod, but we can also see the front brake ducts. Interesting shapes going on there. You can see that those brake ducts are basically continuous curves, just shrouding the inside surfaces of the front tires, allowing that air to be rammed in to the brake ducts and then cool the brake rotors. We've seen similar designs to this in the past, nothing too spectacular going on there. However, on the brake ducts, we can see these small winglets that are just protruding from the inboard surfaces of the brake ducts and then projecting themselves a little bit toward the chassis until they turn 90 degrees forward and then project themselves forward toward the front wing. Not entirely sure why they've gone for this design. It probably has something to do with controlling turbulence while there is steering angle dialed into the car. Again, we'll have to see how the flow-vis, that's the fluorescent paint that the teams tend to spray all over their cars when they go testing, we'll have to see if we can find any dispersion patterns in the flow-vis in relation to the front end of the car. If we're able to get those sorts of pictures, we just might. You never know. Testing is an interesting thing to watch, so that will be a subject of interest. Also from here, and we're going to have a slightly better shot coming up, but we can see the geometries of the rear wing end plates there, and I don't know if my eyes are deceiving me, but the rear wing itself looks a touch narrow. I don't know. Perhaps it's the angle of this shot. Perhaps it's because of the backdrop and it's a little bit difficult to define scaling and relative sizes, but that rear wing looks a little bit narrow to me in comparison to the other cars that we have seen. I'm not sure what Force India are doing here. Perhaps they have some older parts fitted to the car simply because it is launch spec and they do want to keep many things secret at this point. But regardless of how I am looking at the rear wing in terms of relative size, we can see the end plate geometries there. They are multifaceted in terms of their profile. They come up from the floor vertically, and then they go out at about a 45-degree angle in an outboard direction before they return to vertical and then meet up with the main plane of the rear wing. Interesting design so far. It looks like an interesting compromise between the geometries we've seen on the Sauber and the Renault. The Renault being more complicated than this, and the Sauber being a bit more simplistic. So Force India seeming so far to be slotting in between Sauber and Renault in terms of some of the complexities of their car's design. And in this shot, for the first time, we see the car in profile, and for the first time we can get a better sense of the overall livery. Force India running this very striking black, silver, and orange livery this year, with a little hint of green, so most of the Indian national colors are represented here. I do not see any blue, however, on this car, and the wheel in the center of the Indian flag is rendered in blue, so I don't know, perhaps a driver's helmet will help to complete that, but interesting livery here, very striking. I can't say I like it very much in terms of it being visually interesting, but it's appropriate to their sponsors, most of which are owned by VJM10, who is also the team owner and team principal, and after whom the car is named, the VJM, obviously standing for VJM10. The technical detail, the main one that we can divine from this shot, is the shark fin. This is the third Formula One car so far that we've seen in the flesh to feature a shark fin. And I have to say, what are you doing, guys? For the first time, I'm going to go out on the internet and criticize a Formula One team, because if that is the final version of the shark fin, and again, this is launch spec, all of this can change. Of course it can change. But if that's the final version of the shark fin, I am going to submit an application to Force India F1 team, because I think I could design a better shark fin than that. It looks like they have simply taken a rectangular piece of carbon and bisected it at 45 degrees from one corner to another and stuck it on the rear of the car. It just doesn't look good at all. There's a little bit of sculpting going on toward the extreme tip of the shark fin off to screen left. You can see how the most lateral, most left vertical side of that shark fin is curving slightly outward, and then it meets up with the horizontal side up on the top. But basically, it's a rectangle that they've cut in half long ways, and it does not look good. Come on, guys. The other details that we can divine here, first off, the barge boards. Large barge boards on this car, and because it's black on black, the detail is a little bit difficult to discern here, but you can see the barge boards, you can see VJM10, and then a stripe rendered in green across the front surface of those barge boards, so we can at least get some sense of the curvature profile in that concave section of the barge board, but very large, very comparable to the size of barge board that Sauber have launched with. However, the Renault barge boards are a bit smaller and seem to be going after a slightly different aero philosophy altogether. So these barge boards more comparable to the Sauber than they are to the Renault. The two other details that we can divine here, first of all, we have the rear wing end plate geometry. You can see how it's swept rearwards just like all the other 2017 cars that we have seen so far. Also, just like all the other cars, we have gills cut into the upper section of those end fences on the rear wing. Again, this is just to control high angle of attack stalls so that there's no overpressure effect going on the rear wing and negating downforce, which would be a big problem. The final detail that we can just sort of make out is on the front end of the car. I mentioned that step plane before, and we can see it rather substantially here from this shot. The front of the chassis just stops. It stops and then it just juts sharply downward to meet up with the tip of the nose all the way down past the front wing. I don't know if it just is a particularly bad angle for this, but it looks like a very, very large animal stepped on the front end of the car and just crushed it, because it's that is just an extremely obtuse angle, and it just doesn't look good at all. I don't know why they've chosen not to fit a vanity panel here, but again, perhaps it has something to do with their suspension geometry, perhaps it has something to do with where they were able to mount the front suspension dampers, but I don't know about this one. It's not looking very pretty at the moment. And here we are pulling in closely again toward a front three-quarter view, and we can get a better glimpse now of the front wing configuration. We can see, yes, it is a very complex wing, as I said before, and we do have that delta profile, which is ubiquitous up and down the grid. We can get some sense of the cascade elements here, although the contrast is to be desired. Again, it's black on black, but you can see the complexities of that front wing and just a little bit of the complexities of the end fences on this front wing. It's very difficult to discern individual details here, but it does look like we have some layering of aero devices, little turning vanes and flick-ups on the end fences of the front wing. Of course, all of this is subject to change. We also get a better view here of that nose. So we have the center finger section that is protruding out almost to the tip of the front wing, and then we have the two pylons on either side of that, to which the wing is actually mounted and providing a zone for air to accelerate through on its way to the center section of the car, the T-tray, the radiators, and ultimately the floor. The other thing that we have a better vantage point on from this shot is the step, and it's interesting here because they have constructed this very bulbous, almost protrusion section of the top of the chassis that leads down into the step, and they have not tried to smooth this out at all. It just completely steps down. You have the top of the chassis, bump, and then you have the nose section. You can also very clearly see that shut line where the nose cone actually attaches to the front of the chassis. So where you see that step come down to its lowest point, that is definitively the front of the chassis. Unlike the Renault that we looked at yesterday, you can see where the push rods come into the chassis, the push rod pickup points on the top of the chassis. Those points are rather far removed from the extreme front end of the car. So unlike what Renault have done with probably mounting their dampers along the step plane, Force India have mounted their dampers squarely on top of the car. Now this is worse for center of gravity, and it does make things a little bit more inflexible when it comes to different aero solutions that they may be able to field on this car. I'm going to tell you right now that unless they do a substantial redesign of the chassis, and a substantial redesign of the suspension geometry, they will not be able to implement anything like an S-duct, for example, because they just don't have the space for it. Right where those suspension pickup points are is where you would expect an S-duct to be. So unless they come up with something extremely radical in testing or in the beginning part of the season, Force India are not going to be running any sort of S-ducts. Because of that, I think they have limited themselves in terms of the overall potential of aero development on this car straight away, and that third place in the Constructors' Championship, I don't think that's going to happen if Renault have anything to say about it, much less what Red Bull, Mercedes, Ferrari, or maybe even McLaren may have to say about it. So, Force India, I don't know about this. I think you have put the cart before the horse in terms of your ambitions, and your car, I don't know right now. But it remains to be seen. Perhaps we could all be in for a surprise. And on this next shot, we see a rear three-quarter view of the car. Not too many more details that we can discern from this angle other than the geometries of the slots that have been cut into the rear wing end fences. You can get a better view of those gills that were cut into the upper element of the rear wing end plates, again just to control those high angle of attack stalls. And you can also see some striations cut into the bottom section of the rear wing end plates, just like Sauber and just like Renault have done. Force India again pursuing a very similar solution there to control some turbulence that's coming off of the floor in the rear section of the car. We can also get a little bit better angle on that shark fin, the very unintricate and I have to say very unpleasing in an aesthetic sense. That shark fin, just what have you done? Moving away from my obsession with the absolutely terrible looking shark fin, we have the floor, and unlike the Renault, and really unlike the Sauber, the floor is almost entirely flat. I don't see any development work going on at all on the floor section. You can see the reference plane here. You can see a little bit of an upward bend in the floor, just underneath the Sahara logo on the side pod there. But other than that, I don't see anything too substantial going on in this area. Renault, we saw those very small turning vanes just in front of the rear tires, and there's nothing here. It's just a straight piece of carbon. So again, this is launch spec. I feel like I'm saying that a lot in this review, but Force India, I don't know. Take it or leave it. This is what they're giving us right now. Perhaps they're sandbagging an awful lot, but as of this moment, I am not very optimistic as to this car's chances. The Sauber looks more developed than this car is at the moment, and that's really saying something given Sauber's recent form in comparison to Force India's recent form. So they've got a lot riding on this car, Force India, and I hope it can deliver for them. But right now, if I could choose a Formula One car with which to compete in the 2017 season, it would not be this one. And our final shot here today, we just see the car again from another semi-profile view. We get a slightly better view of the side pods and the barge boards in this shot. And one thing I do want to point out on the barge boards is we can see some protrusions, some bulbous sections on the upper side of the barge board here on the right-hand side of the car. I don't know if those are ducts. They could have NACA ducts cut into the top section of the barge board there. It's a little difficult to tell from this angle whether or not the front section of those protrusions is open, but perhaps some interesting NACA ducts cut into the barge boards there. I don't know if that's legal. I assume if they are putting it on the car, it is, but I've not seen that before on a barge board, so perhaps that's an interesting area of development to watch in testing. And also the focal point of this image, you see the three men in the background standing proudly with the car. In the center you have VJM10, the team owner, founder, and team principal. To his right you have Esteban Ocon, who is the new acquisition for Force India this year. He is from France. And then of course you have Sergio Perez, who has been with the team for quite a while now. Perez of course going to be the team leader this year, mentoring Ocon in his first season in Formula One. Perez was very complimentary of Ocon at the launch, and hopefully Ocon will be able to learn something from his more seasoned counterpart. That's about all I've got for you for the Force India VJM10. In terms of technical developments, this seems to be the least developed car that we have seen thus far in 2017. However, we have more cars to come, and of course, we have it all to play for this season. So at this point, I don't think we can count anybody out, even though I have to say the Force India is the sloppiest car that we have seen thus far. One more thing that I have just caught sight of, look at the barge board, and then look immediately behind it and slightly downward. You can see where they have patched in, by the looks of it, some areas of carbon on the bottom of the tub. I don't know if that's a trick of light, but it looks like the weave of the carbon there is not continuous, and those look to be rather substantial sections of the car that have been almost patched in by the looks of it. So I don't know if that says anything as to the true origin of the chassis that we see in front of us. I don't know. For all intents and purposes, this could be a 2014 or a 2015 chassis that they have simply dressed up to look like a 2017 chassis. I don't know, but to see carbon laid up like that from a Formula One team, that's not something that we have seen basically since the 1980s when carbon fiber was a brand new technology. So that's a little disconcerting. Again, just adding to my overall shaky impressions on this car. Design-wise, it's not even as complicated as the Sauber, and it certainly doesn't look as good. And in terms of the Renault, if I had to choose a car to compete in based off of what we've seen so far, I would be driving that Renault, not the Sauber and not the Force India. So, alright guys, here's what you've got. Now develop it and make it come good, because you've got two drivers there who are itching to be competitive, and of course you have a team owner in VJM10 who wants to continue the team's upward momentum. So here's what you've got. Make it come good. As far as this review, that is all I have got for you today. It has been a lot of fun presenting these launch spec pictures to all of you and giving you my thoughts. I have also greatly enjoyed hearing your thoughts and receiving your compliments on the reviews that I've been doing. Thank you very much for those. I do read them. If I do not get the chance to respond to all of them, just know that you are being heard and your engagement is still being appreciated. Please continue to let me know what you think of the reviews and what you think of the cars in general. More launch spec videos will be on the way once we see more 2017 Formula One cars. Thank you all very, very much for watching, and of course stay tuned for more 2017 Formula One content. Ferrari Man 601 saying thank you guys, and we will see you soon.